In 1962, 3 inmates vanished from the most secure prison in America, Alcatraz. Did they escape to freedom? Or did the icy waters of San Francisco Bay become their grave? Tonight, we dig deep into one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries to uncover the truth. Imagine being locked inside the most notorious prison in the world, a place designed to be escape-proof, surrounded by frigid waters and deadly currents. Yet, in 1962, 3 men pulled off the impossible and vanished into the night. The question that still haunts investigators and historians alike: did they survive to taste freedom? Or did Alcatraz claim their lives forever? In the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by icy waters, sharp currents, and an eerie fog that rolls in like a curtain of mystery, sits a small rocky island that has fascinated the world for generations. Known as Alcatraz, this tiny island holds a reputation that is larger than life. For decades, it was called the inescapable prison, a fortress carved into stone, fortified by steel, and wrapped in fear. Those who were sent here were not just ordinary criminals. They were the ones who had pushed the limits of the American justice system, men too dangerous, too cunning, or too violent to be contained anywhere else. The Rock, as it was ominously called, was the government's answer to a haunting question: what do you do with men who refuse to be locked away? The very location of Alcatraz was part of its defense. Unlike mainland prisons, this one did not need towering walls topped with barbed wire to keep its captives in. The sea itself was the guard. Frigid waters, often dipping to dangerously low temperatures, churned with deadly tides and unpredictable currents. Local fishermen used to say that if the sharks didn't get you, the water would. To the guards and officials, Alcatraz was more than just a prison. It was a psychological weapon, a place designed to strip away every illusion of escape. The men who arrived here stepped off the ferry with chains on their wrists and despair in their eyes, knowing they had been delivered to a place that did not forgive mistakes. But what gave Alcatraz its legendary status wasn't just its physical barriers. It was the aura of fear carefully cultivated by the stories that surrounded it. Former prisoners spoke of the crushing isolation, the bone-chilling cold that seeped into your body at night, and the sense that time itself slowed on the island. Guards maintained strict control, with constant head counts, cell checks, and rules designed to break the spirit. Inmates described the silence as unbearable, broken only by the distant sound of laughter drifting from the city across the bay, a cruel reminder of a life forever out of reach. Alcatraz was a world apart, close enough for prisoners to see freedom, but too far to ever touch it. Some of the most infamous criminals in American history passed through these steel gates. Al Capone, the ruthless Chicago mobster, spent years here, stripped of his power and influence. George "Machine Gun" Kelly, the gangster whose name terrorized cities, was locked in a cell like any other man. Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, the last of the Depression-era public enemies, found himself here as well, his name just another on a long list of broken men who had once thought themselves untouchable. Their presence gave the Rock its notoriety. If these powerful and cunning men could not escape, then who could? The architecture of Alcatraz reflected its purpose. Rows of cold, narrow cells stood side by side, each barely large enough for a man to stretch his arms. Metal bars and steel doors echoed with the clanging of chains, and the corridors were nicknamed with chilling titles like Broadway and Times Square, as if mocking the bustling life that prisoners would never again experience. Even recreation was a cruel twist of fate. From the prison yard, men could see the glittering skyline of San Francisco. They could hear the horns of ships, the calls of seagulls, the noise of life continuing just beyond their reach. That view, so close yet impossibly far, was one of the harshest punishments the island could deliver. Every detail of Alcatraz was meant to break down human resilience. Lights never dimmed fully in the cell blocks. Guards maintained watch from multiple towers, and patrol boats circled the waters day and night. To attempt escape was not just dangerous, it was suicide. Men who dared to try were almost always killed in the process. Over the years, many had dreamed of freedom, and a few even tried, but the official record insisted that no one had ever succeeded. Prison authorities claimed that every escapee was either captured or drowned in the waters, their bodies pulled into the tides and never recovered. The island itself seemed to whisper the same message to its captives: escape is impossible. And yet, human history has always shown that the more impossible something seems, the more determined people become to defy it. Alcatraz was designed to hold the most unbreakable men, but in truth, it became the perfect stage for a daring act of defiance. Within its walls, some prisoners began to see cracks in the fortress, not in its stone or steel, but in the certainty that it could not be beaten. The legend of Alcatraz as an impenetrable fortress was about to be tested, and the world would soon question whether the rock was truly unbreakable or whether it was just another cage waiting for the right men to outsmart it. Inside the cold, regimented world of Alcatraz, not every prisoner was broken. Some refused to surrender to the hopelessness of the rock. Among the countless men who had walked its narrow halls, 3 stood out, not because they were the most violent or the most famous, but because they carried within them an unusual mix of intelligence, patience, and determination. These men were Frank Morris and the brothers John and Clarence Anglin. Together, they would carve their names into history with one of the most daring prison escapes the world has ever known. Frank Morris was unlike most inmates who found themselves in Alcatraz. Born into poverty, abandoned as a child, and raised in foster care, he learned early on that survival meant relying on his wits. His childhood was a revolving door of reform schools and juvenile detention centers, each one failing to contain him. By the time he reached adulthood, Frank had built a reputation as a man of extraordinary intelligence and resourcefulness. He scored in the top 2% of the general population on IQ tests, a detail that stood out in the prison records. To the authorities, this intelligence made him dangerous. To himself, it meant opportunity. Frank was not a man who simply accepted confinement. He studied his environment, searching for weaknesses, analyzing routines, always thinking one step ahead. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, shared a different story, but one equally marked by hardship and survival. They were born into a poor family of Florida farm workers, the kind of upbringing where children learned resilience before they even learned to read. The brothers grew up inseparable, always looking out for each other, always thinking as a team. When their family moved to Georgia and later to Michigan, they carried with them not just the bonds of brotherhood, but a growing reputation for trouble. Their crimes were rarely violent. They were skilled at burglary, particularly bank robberies, often entering at night, bypassing alarms, and slipping away without confrontation. Their hands were steady, their minds quick, and together they became experts in the kind of quiet, calculated theft that relied on precision rather than chaos. But prison had already been a revolving door for them too. Both brothers spent years moving in and out of jails across the country, constantly testing boundaries, constantly escaping, until finally their persistence landed them in Alcatraz. Authorities believed the rock would succeed where other prisons had failed. What they underestimated was the power of loyalty and the shared dream of freedom between 2 brothers who never left each other's side. When Frank Morris crossed paths with the Anglin brothers inside Alcatraz, a rare alignment occurred. 3 men with complementary skills, 3 men hardened by a lifetime of running, 3 men unwilling to accept the word impossible. Frank brought the brains, the sharp planning, and the ability to study systems with a near-clinical eye. The Anglin brothers brought craftsmanship, patience, and teamwork that had been refined since childhood. What connected them was a shared belief that no cage was truly unbreakable. In Alcatraz, survival often meant keeping your head down, following orders, and waiting out your sentence. But Frank and the Anglins were not men built for waiting. They studied their environment carefully, paying attention to small details others ignored. They observed guard shifts, listened to the sounds of the prison, memorized the timing of movements, and shared quiet conversations in the yard where plans began to take shape. They were not reckless. Dreamers, but disciplined planners, each man aware that a single mistake could mean death in the bay or a bullet from the tower. Yet despite the high stakes, they seemed almost destined to meet. Frank had a long history of prison escapes, slipping out of facilities that were considered secure. His confidence came not from arrogance but from experience. He knew how to exploit cracks in the system, how to use patience as a weapon, how to wait for the right moment. The Anglin brothers, on the other hand, carried with them not just skill but loyalty to each other. They had an unspoken rule: neither would attempt something without the other. It was this unbreakable bond that gave them strength, a unity of purpose that made them more than just inmates. They were partners in defiance. The prison guards likely saw them as just another set of faces in the endless rows of convicts, but beneath the surface something was brewing. The three men were quietly building trust, exchanging ideas, and dreaming of a night when they would no longer be just names on a roster but fugitives rewriting history. Other prisoners may have entertained fantasies of breaking free, but most gave up quickly when faced with the brutal reality of the rock. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were different. They didn't see walls and water as barriers. They saw them as challenges to overcome. It was a combination of grit, intelligence, and resilience that set them apart. Frank's sharp mind and ability to solve problems under pressure, John and Clarence's steady determination and mechanical skill, and their shared refusal to accept a life sentence inside the island made them dangerous together. This unlikely trio would soon begin to transform the impossible into reality, testing every assumption about the prison that had been designed to break men and hold them forever against their will. The plan to escape from Alcatraz did not begin with a sudden burst of inspiration. It was born from long, quiet nights in the cells, the kind of nights when the silence pressed down so heavily that a man's mind could either collapse or sharpen to a dangerous edge. For Frank Morris and for John and Clarence Anglin, the silence became an opportunity. They knew that if they were ever to challenge the island's reputation as escape-proof, they could not afford a single reckless move. Every detail had to be calculated, every risk weighed, every step rehearsed in their minds until it became second nature. This was not going to be an act of desperation, but an act of patience, discipline, and brilliance. Their cells were not cages in the traditional sense. To most prisoners, they were small concrete boxes, unyielding and absolute. But Frank saw something else. He noticed that behind the air vents at the back of the cells lay a utility corridor, a narrow passage that connected to other parts of the prison. The cement around these vents was weak. Years of moisture and salt air had eroded its strength, and with the right tools, a hole could be widened. What to others looked like nothing more than an old vent became, in the minds of these men, a doorway to freedom. Tools were their first necessity, but where could prisoners on a tightly controlled island find anything capable of cutting through stone and steel? The answer came from the workshops and their daily routines. Frank and the Anglin brothers began collecting spoons, scraps of metal, and anything sharp enough to chip away at concrete. Even more ingeniously, they modified stolen objects into makeshift drills, cobbling together a crude device using a motor taken from a prison vacuum cleaner. By hand and by machine, they slowly carved into the walls, each night removing just enough to make progress without attracting attention. The act of digging was painstaking. Concrete dust had to be hidden, scraped walls had to be disguised, and noise had to be masked by the din of music and conversations that filled the prison during certain hours. When guards approached, the men worked calmly, as if nothing was unusual. To cover the widening holes, they crafted false walls made of cardboard and paint that blended seamlessly with the prison's interior. A quick glance from a guard would never reveal the deception. It was a magician's trick performed in plain sight, with their very lives hanging in the balance. But tunneling out was only the beginning. Even if they reached the corridor, they needed a way to vanish from the island itself. The waters around Alcatraz had claimed many who dared to swim. The trio studied the bay, its currents, its tides, and the winds. They realized they would need something that could not just float but survive the harsh waves. The idea of a raft was born, but how could men behind bars build one? The answer was as improbable as it was ingenious: raincoats. Over 50 prison-issued raincoats, stolen piece by piece, were stitched and sealed together using heat from pipes and glue from stolen materials. The result was a makeshift raft and life vest, designed with the determination of men who had no other choice but success. The deception went further still. To ensure their absence wasn't noticed during nighthead counts, the men crafted dummies to take their place in bed. Using plaster, soap, and even real human hair collected from the prison barbershop, They fashioned eerily lifelike heads. When positioned under blankets, these decoys created the illusion of sleeping inmates, their silent faces convincing enough to fool guards glancing in during the night. Each detail was designed to buy them precious hours, enough to slip away and vanish into the darkness before the alarm was raised. This plan was not executed overnight. It stretched across months, a testament to their patience and their absolute commitment. Night after night, while the rest of the prison slept, they chipped away, concealed their progress, and rehearsed the steps that would one day take them from the confines of their cells to the roof of Alcatraz and into the unforgiving waters beyond. Every move they made had to be invisible. Every conversation had to be disguised as casual chatter. Every piece of stolen material had to blend into the chaos of prison life. What makes their story even more astonishing is the level of coordination it required. In a place where guards watched every move, where informants whispered secrets in exchange for favors, the fact that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers managed to keep their operation hidden is remarkable. They trusted no one outside their circle, shared nothing that could expose them, and relied solely on each other's loyalty and silence. The plan was not just about breaking stone and bending rules. It was about building trust strong enough to carry them through the most dangerous gamble of their lives. For most prisoners, the dream of escape remained just that, a fantasy whispered in the yard, a fleeting thought during long nights. But for these three men, it became a reality constructed piece by piece, spoon by spoon, coat by coat. They had created not just an escape plan, but a work of ingenuity that mocked the very idea of Alcatraz being escape-proof. Every hole dug, every decoy crafted, every seam sealed in a raincoat raft brought them closer to the night when they would finally test the prison's reputation against their determination to be free. June 11, 1962. The night began like any other on Alcatraz. Guards made their usual rounds, the clanging of cell doors echoed in the distance, and the strict rhythm of prison life carried on with mechanical precision. Yet, behind the cold concrete walls of three adjacent cells, a secret was unfolding, a plan that had been patiently built for months. Tonight, the rock's reputation as an impenetrable fortress was about to be put to the ultimate test. As the evening head count passed without suspicion, Frank Morris lay still in his bunk, his body calm but his mind alive with focus. Across the narrow rows of cells, John and Clarence Anglin mirrored the same quiet resolve. They knew this night could be their last. Every detail had been rehearsed in silence, every movement choreographed in their minds. There was no room for hesitation. Tonight was the moment when months of secrecy, fear, and relentless effort would either carry them to freedom or condemn them to death in the dark waters of the bay. When the lights dimmed and the prison settled into its uneasy sleep, the trio made their move. Carefully, each man reached beneath his blanket, pulling into place the plaster and papier-mâché heads they had sculpted with meticulous care. With real hair glued on from clippings stolen at the barbershop, the dummies looked convincingly human, their faces half hidden in shadows. From the narrow view of a guard making rounds, they would appear to be nothing more than exhausted inmates drifting in restless sleep. With their beds disguised, the men slipped silently into the back corners of their cells. They pushed away the fake wall pieces they had crafted to cover the gaping holes behind their events. For months, they had widened those holes with stolen spoons and makeshift drills, scraping away concrete in the dead of night, carefully scattering the dust into pockets or flushing it down drains. Tonight, the holes were large enough to pass through, barely, forcing each man to squeeze his body into the narrow opening, his chest pressing against rough stone, his lungs tightening with every inch. On the other side, the utility corridor awaited them, dark and damp, filled with the hum of pipes and the metallic scent of rust. Crawling through this hidden artery of the prison, they moved like shadows, careful to make as little sound as possible. A single clang or misplaced step could bring the entire plan crashing down. For Frank, the leader of the escape, each moment was measured, each breath calculated. For the Anglin brothers, the loyalty that had carried them through their lives was now tested in silence. They had promised never to leave each other behind, and tonight that promise guided their every move. Climbing upwards through the interior of the prison, they reached a utility pipe that stretched toward the roof. The climb was treacherous, their hands slick with sweat, their muscles straining as they pulled themselves upward. One slip meant certain capture or worse, a fall that would end everything. But adrenaline kept them steady, and together they ascended into the shadows above the cell block. Emerging onto the roof, the men were met with the chilling night air and the vast, open expanse of the island. The glow of San Francisco's city lights shimmered faintly across the bay, so close it seemed they could almost touch it. Freedom lay just beyond the water, but the hardest part was still ahead. Guards patrolled the towers, searchlights cut through the fog, and every second spent exposed was a risk. Moving low and fast, they carried their most precious cargo, the makeshift raft and life vests, painstakingly stitched from over 50 stolen raincoats. The raft was their only hope of crossing the deadly currents that had swallowed so many before them. They descended the side of the prison, maneuvering carefully along pipes and rooftops until they reached the ground. The silence of the island was broken only by the distant crash of waves against the rocks and the mournful call of seagulls circling in the dark. In that moment, the three fugitives were ghosts, slipping past the watchful eyes of the guards, leaving behind the prison that had claimed the lives and spirits of countless men before them. At the shoreline, the task of inflating the raft began. Using a stolen accordion as a pump, they worked quickly, the rubberized seams of the raincoat material taking shape under their hands. The tide was against them, the water frigid, and time was running out. If a guard happened to glance in their direction, if a searchlight swept too far, if even the faintest sound carried across the still night, their plan would unravel. But fortune seemed to favor them. The island remained quiet, the guards unaware, and the raft slowly took its form. By now, the prison was a world away behind them. In their cells, the plaster heads rested peacefully on pillows, fooling any casual observer who walked past. Hours would pass before the deception was discovered. For Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, the moment of truth had arrived. With their raft inflated and their improvised paddles ready, they dragged the vessel to the water's edge, their eyes fixed on the distant glow of the mainland. The waves slapped against the rocks with merciless rhythm, the currents tugged and twisted with invisible hands, and the water itself was a graveyard of failed dreams. Yet they pushed forward, lowering the raft into the black waters of the bay. Climbing inside, their hearts pounded with both fear and hope. The prison loomed behind them like a silent beast, watching, waiting. Ahead of them lay the unknown death in the icy depths, or the sweet taste of freedom that had eluded every man before them by the time dawn broke over San Francisco Bay on June 12, 1962. Alcatraz was in chaos. Guards making their morning rounds discovered the deception. The plaster heads stared blankly back from the bunks, painted faces frozen in eerie stillness. The holes in the walls, the missing men, the carefully crafted raft materials, it all told a chilling story. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had vanished into the night. But had they reached freedom, or had the icy grip of the bay claimed them forever? That question became one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. The official version, declared swiftly by the FBI and prison authorities, was simple: the men had drowned. The bay, after all, was infamous for its unforgiving nature. The waters averaged a chilling 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures that could sap the strength of even the strongest swimmer in less than an hour. The tides were powerful, sweeping outward toward the Pacific Ocean with a force that made even experienced sailors wary. Many inmates had attempted to swim the distance over the years, and the official record was clear: none had survived. To the government, this was not an escape, it was a failed attempt ending in death. Yet the evidence was never that clear-cut. Within days of the escape, search teams scoured the bay, helicopters buzzing overhead, patrol boats combing the waves. What they found only deepened the mystery. A makeshift paddle, carved from plywood, was discovered floating in the water. Fragments of the raincoat raft washed ashore on Angel Island, just north of Alcatraz. To some, this was proof the men had made it at least partway across. To others, it was evidence of disaster, signs that the raft had broken apart and cast its passengers into the freezing currents. The question of survival has haunted investigators ever since. Oceanographers later studied the tides of that night and discovered something remarkable. At precisely the time the men are believed to have entered the water, the currents would have carried them not out to sea, but directly toward Angel Island. If they paddled with even minimal effort, they could have made landfall. But if their timing was off by just 30 minutes, the currents would have swept them into the vast Pacific, their bodies lost forever beneath the waves. The bay itself seemed to play the role of executioner or savior, depending on which theory one chose to believe. The FBI clung to the belief in death, but rumors began to swirl almost immediately. Families of the Anglin brothers claimed to receive mysterious unsigned postcards and holiday cards over the years, always written in a familiar hand, always without a return address. Some claim the brothers had slipped into South America, living quietly under new identities, far from the reach of American law. Decades later, photographs surfaced that allegedly showed John and Clarence Anglin alive in Brazil during the 1970s, standing in front of a farmhouse, their faces weathered but recognizable. Forensic experts who examined the photographs could not dismiss the possibility that they were authentic. In 2013, the mystery deepened even further when a letter surfaced, sent to authorities and allegedly written by John Anglin himself. In it, the writer claimed that all three men had survived that night, though Frank Morris had passed away in 2008 and Clarence had died 3 years later. The letter pleaded for medical treatment in exchange for revealing his identity, suggesting that the fugitive life had finally taken its toll. The FBI never confirmed its authenticity, but handwriting experts admitted it was possible the letter was genuine. If true, it meant the impossible had been achieved. Three men had escaped the rock and lived in the shadows for decades. Still, skeptics argue that survival was unlikely. They point to the lack of concrete evidence, no confirmed sightings, no fingerprints, no verifiable trail. They remind us that the bay is merciless, that hypothermia can strike quickly, that exhaustion can drag even the strongest swimmer beneath the surface. For them, the broken raft and the paddle are not signs of success, but of failure, artifacts left behind in a desperate struggle against nature. In their view, the men may have vanished not because they reached freedom, but because the sea consumed them. The truth lies buried in uncertainty, balanced between legend and fact. For every piece of evidence suggesting death, another emerges hinting at survival. Theories have multiplied over the decades, each one more tantalizing than the last. Did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers vanish into a new life, blending seamlessly into communities thousands of miles away, watching silently as the world debated their fate? Or did they meet their end that very night, swallowed by the black waters that surrounded their prison, their bones resting in the silence of the bay? The mystery endures because no definitive proof has ever surfaced. Authorities have closed the case, but curiosity continues to breathe life into the legend. For some, it is a story of triumph, of three men who defied the impossible and outsmarted the most secure prison in America. For others, it is a cautionary tale of desperation, ending not with freedom, but with cold, watery death beneath the currents of San Francisco Bay. And as long as no body is found, no identity confirmed, the question will always remain. Lingering like the fog that clings to the island, freedom or death in the days and weeks after the escape, Alcatraz became the focus of one of the most intense investigations in American history. The prison officials wanted answers, the FBI demanded closure, and the public was captivated by the idea that three men might have achieved the impossible. But the more investigators searched, the more the lines between fact and rumor began to blur. Evidence surfaced in fragments, whispers spread like wildfire, and the legend of the Alcatraz escape grew larger with every passing year. Search teams scoured the bay and the surrounding shorelines for weeks after the escape. Patrol boats swept the waters while helicopters hovered overhead, eyes scanning for any sign of the missing men. What they found was a curious collection of clues. On Angel Island, investigators discovered a crude paddle and pieces of the raincoat raft that had clearly been used. A wallet was recovered containing names, photographs, and addresses connected to the Anglin family. To the FBI, these discoveries seemed to suggest the raft had fallen apart, dooming the men to the cold depths of the bay. Yet none of the bodies were ever found, and the bay, notorious for pulling the drowned to the surface within days, remained silent. The absence of bodies raised an unsettling question. If the waters had claimed them, why was there no trace of their remains? Families of the Anglin brothers refused to believe they had died. Over the years, they spoke of receiving mysterious postcards and letters, unsigned but written in handwriting that felt familiar. Some even claimed the brothers had made contact with them in secret, careful not to reveal too much, always remaining one step ahead of discovery. In the 1970s, photographs surfaced showing two men in Brazil standing beside a farmhouse. To the untrained eye, they looked ordinary, but to relatives, they looked like John and Clarence Anglin, older, worn by time, but unmistakably themselves. Forensic experts later analyzed the images and concluded there was a strong possibility that the men in the photographs were indeed the Anglins. If true, it meant they had crossed not only the bay but the borders of nations, carving out a life in exile while the world believed them long dead. The mystery deepened again decades later when a letter surfaced in 2013, allegedly written by John Anglin himself. The letter claimed that all three men had survived the escape, but time had taken its toll. Frank Morris, the brilliant mind behind the plan, had died in 2008. Clarence Anglin had passed away 3 years later. John claimed he was sick and in need of medical treatment, offering to reveal his identity in exchange for help. The FBI could not conclusively authenticate the letter, but handwriting analysis and forensic reviews left the door open. It could not be dismissed entirely. If genuine, it meant the impossible had happened, that Alcatraz's most famous escape had not ended in tragedy but in decades of life hidden in the shadows. Authorities, however, remained skeptical. The FBI officially closed its investigation in 1979, maintaining the stance that the men drowned the night of their escape. Yet the U.S. Marshals Service kept the case open, citing the possibility, however slim, that the fugitives were still alive. To this day, their files remain active, their names listed as wanted men, a quiet acknowledgement that the story may not have ended on that cold June night. Beyond the official record, the legend of the escape has taken on a life of its own. Movies, books, and documentaries have kept the story alive, each one exploring new angles, each one feeding the fascination of audiences who wonder what really happened. The mystery has become more than just a tale of three inmates. It has become a symbol of defiance, of human ingenuity against impossible odds. Alcatraz was built to break men, but the escape proved that determination could crack even the hardest stone. Even today, modern technology has tried to solve the riddle. Computer simulations of the tides have been run, analyzing the currents from that fateful night. The results show that survival was possible, but only if the men launched their raft at the precise time they did. Any earlier, and the tide would have swept them out to sea. Any later, and the currents would have carried them into the Golden Gate, a death sentence in the open Pacific. It seemed almost as though fate itself had conspired to give them a narrow window of possibility, one they may have seized perfectly. The legacy of the escape is written not only in the official reports, but in the whispers that continue to this day. Tour guides on Alcatraz still recount the story to millions of visitors each year, pointing to the very cells where the escape began, showing the holes carved in the concrete, displaying the eerie plaster heads that fooled the guards. Visitors gaze at the waters surrounding the island, asking themselves the same question that has haunted investigators for over 60 years. Did they make it? The Anglin family still holds to their belief that John and Clarence lived, perhaps for many years, perhaps still even alive today. Others insist the men perished, their story ending the moment they set foot in the water. The FBI's stance and the family's claims stand in direct opposition, a clash between official narrative and personal conviction. And between them lies a mystery that refuses to die, a story that has outlived the prison itself, which closed in 1963, just 1 year after the escape. What remains is an enduring enigma, a story of three men who dared to challenge the most feared prison in the world. And the question that no investigation, no scientific study, and no rumor has ever fully answered, whether they found freedom or met their fate in the dark waters of San Francisco Bay for over 6 decades, the Alcatraz escape has remained one of the most captivating mysteries in American history. Three men, locked away in the nation's most secure prison, used nothing but determination, ingenuity, and desperation to attempt the impossible. From digging through concrete with makeshift tools, to crafting a raft out of raincoats, to slipping past guards who believed they were asleep in their bunks, the escape was a story of grit, patience, and raw human will. Yet beyond the daring plan lies the haunting question that has never been answered. Did Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers claim their freedom on that cold June night, vanishing into the world to live in secret? Or did the unforgiving waters of San Francisco Bay claim their lives, turning their bold attempt into a final act of defiance against the rock? Evidence has surfaced over the years, each piece pulling the mystery in different directions. A wallet found on shore, a raft fragment washed up, photographs from Brazil, an alleged letter decades later. Some point to survival, others to tragedy. The authorities hold firm to the belief that escape was impossible. But families, eyewitnesses, and countless investigators refuse to accept that answer. And perhaps that is why this story endures. Because the Alcatraz escape is more than a prison break, it is a timeless riddle about human spirit. It forces us to ask, how far would you go for freedom? Could you risk everything, knowing that success meant a new life, but failure meant certain death? As long as the waters of the bay remain silent, the truth will stay just out of reach. Maybe the men found their way to safety, their names erased, but their story alive in whispers. Or maybe the tide claimed them, burying their fate beneath the waves. The only certainty is that the rock was never the same again. The escape from Alcatraz was not just a daring plan, it was a challenge to authority, a battle of human will against a fortress built to break it. And today the question still lingers, echoing through time: did they find freedom, or did they meet death?